After 6 rounds in the Qatar Masters Open, Anish Giri was leading with 100%. He'd scored 6 straight wins. In clear second position, Vladimir Kramnik. So in round 7 they met, and this was the clash of the two top seeds in the tournament. Kramnik had white, and he opened with his favourite d4, and well, this opening can lead in many different directions. Kramnik used to be a great exponent of bishop g5 here. You can also play e3, but today he selected pawn to g3, which could lead into a kind of closed Catalan position, but Anish Giri took up the gauntlet and captured the gambit pawn on c4. Interesting that Kramnik is playing in this way, a clear indication that he's going for a win. Obviously, it's going to be very difficult to recapture that pawn on c4. But white has a big central position. Nice knight on e5. Now, if black defends this pawn on c6 with bishop b7, then this allows a tactic, a very typical tactic for this line. You can see the power of this Catalan bishop on g2, exploiting the pin. So that's why black plays a6. And now if knight takes c6, then it looks very good for white, but actually queen b6 is a well-known move, and here there's no really good discovered attack for the knight, and black is all ready to, well, after an exchange of knights to get the bishop to b7, black stands fine there. Therefore, castles, and black protects the pawn on c6 now, and Kramnik turns this into a pure gambit by playing the pawn to b3. Black exchanges. So white a pawn down, but has very good compensation in the form of this nice central pawn on d4, controls the centre, but also you can see there are weak squares here, and white already has the rook developed on an active square, even though it hasn't moved yet, on the a file. So black castles, white continues development, and here is a very subtle point. Kramnik played the very natural move queen c2, but he said afterwards that knight e4 is a more accurate move and it should transpose to what happens in the game. But after queen c2, Giri, who's perhaps not so familiar with this position, failed to find a good move. Knight d7 is an excellent move because, I mean, clearly this is standard developing move, but the point is that after white takes here on c6, then comes rook c8, and there are tactics here. White, of course, would like to play bishop b7, but then black wins material because of this pin on the c-file. So white would have to exchange on d7, and this position is about equal. But instead of queen c2, that's why knight e4 should be played. And in that case, knight d7 really isn't very good. In that case, white is doing well. So it's very subtle. So queen c2 inaccurate, but Giri failed to spot knight bd7 and played knight back to d7. And now Kramnik is back in the swing of things. Knight d3 is a good move. Obviously, black lacks space here. He's very cramped. So allowing an exchange of pieces, allowing the knight to be exchanged on e5, would be a fundamental error. And he withdraws the knight to d3, a lovely square, looking at that weak square on c5. Queen b6, good move. Black needs to develop, and knight e4. So you can see that Kramnik has this c5 square under control. And now he sits the knight in on c5. Now this is the first position we should really look at in some detail. How is black going to free his game? First of all, let's look at what happens if black exchanges the knight off. Black still a clear pawn up, but you can see that exchange has opened up this wonderful diagonal for the bishop. The knight stands beautifully on e4, and after this move perhaps threatens to come in to d6. Black's bishop on b7, still a horrible piece blocked in. And you can see that well, white has good chances at some point to turn his attention to the king side, which is, well, lacking defensive pieces. So, exchanging knights, not altogether satisfactory. What about the move f5? Now that is a very risky move, but it is a forcing move. If the knight retreats, then black can take here. I think white has two promising continuations. One, you could simply exchange that bishop. Now, I know it's a bad piece, but it is defending an important pawn, and white still has pressure here. The pawn on e6, very weak now, and even moves like e4 come into consideration to attack on the king side. And another good move after f5 is to just sacrifice and play this position. Once the queen retreats, white can start rolling the pawns forward. So very difficult for black to free his game here. Of course, he would like to play knight a6, but then simply knight takes knight. And that's why Giri retreated the bishop to c8, defending the knight and allowing him to play knight a6. Now Kramnik found a good move. Queen c3, I like this very much. So obviously there's some kind of latent threat on the long diagonal. So that's why Giri pushed the queen away. But having pushed the queen away, you can see that weakens the c4 and a4 squares. So Kramnik gained something by that. Queen e3. I actually like queen c4 here. I think that's the most straightforward move. But Kramnik played queen e3 quite quickly, just reinforcing the knight here. Knight a6 and rook fc1. Kramnik played this game very simply. He wasn't rushed in any way. He was just confident that his pieces were on good squares, that he didn't need to prove too much, and the onus was on black here. Giri played knight c7, heading round to d5. And now Kramnik did exchange, but replaced the knight on c5 with the next one. So pressure here. And this is pretty miserable. If the bishop is defended by a rook, well, you can just exchange and then take on c6. So the bishop retreated to e8. Bit of a blockage. Not very pleasant for black to have to break communication between the rooks. And again, Kramnik just didn't rush things. He just sat there. I still like queen d3 in this position, but he just played rook a2. Just saying to black, okay, what are you doing? Perhaps he'll double on the a file. But there's no rush. He might return to the c file as well. Giri played queen b5, and Kramnik was happy to exchange queens and keep the pressure on these pawns. Giri played knight d5, blocking the bishop, and now knight e5, just increasing the pressure on the pawn on c6. You can see that all white's pieces are in play. Black is struggling, although he still is a pawn up. Now, here's a critical moment in the game. When you're under pressure, you have to decide, do I defend these weak pawns, or do I somehow try to break out, perhaps give one back and liberate my pieces? Here, Giri chose to defend that weak pawn on c6. But one possible option is to give up that pawn, and that frees his pieces to some extent. For example, after this, well, I think white is still better here, but at least black has managed to bring out the bishop. Another way of playing after this takes f6 might be knight f3 to come to d4, then a4, and that liberates black's pieces to some extent. I still think white is better there. Or here, even e4, and then knight c4, and some exchanges. White's still better there. In all these cases, white still has some advantage, but black does free his pieces to some extent. So it's a tough decision for Giri. So he chose to hang on to that pawn on c6, but I think he'd underestimated Kramnik's next move, bishop f1. What a great move. Threatening, obviously, e4, disturbing the rook, hitting the knight on d5. So at this point, Giri did give back his extra pawn, but Kramnik maintains pressure against these weak pawns, and now it's clear that Kramnik stands very well. Giri gave back another pawn, so no Kramnik as a pawn up. But really, this is technically a winning position. And now Kramnik could play e3 here, also good for white, but he chose bishop g2. Very nice, claiming back the long diagonal, threatening bishop b7 and c6, and the pawn is going to go through. So the rook came back, but really this is, well, to use the cliche, a matter of technique for Kramnik, and his technique was superb. Bishop e4, excellent move. Just wanting to play bishop d3, exchanging off that bishop and perhaps bringing the knight back to d3 to cover the b4 square. f6, and now things get worse for Giri. Now the threat is knight d4, hitting bishop and pawn. The rook covered that, but now e3 reinstates that threat, and black is lost here. e5. Now white could even take that pawn. In fact, after this, the rook covers everything. But Kramnik didn't rush it. Very quickly, he just played rook c1, covering the first rank, stepping out of any potential pin, and on the next turn he can perhaps take this pawn. If the bishop covers, then rook c5 anyway. I mean, that's horrible. You can see the pawn on a5 is going to drop. So here Giri, well, he played a4, but this was just desperation. Kramnik took it, and here Giri resigned. If this pawn is recaptured, then white's pawn is simply rolling through, forcing the win of the rook. So a completely convincing victory for Kramnik there. He has a very good record over Giri. It's something like 6-1 in Kramnik's favour in their classical games. So after 7 rounds, 2 players lead the tournament, Kramnik and Giri, with 6 out of 7. And in second position, just half a point behind, we have Saleh Salem from the United Arab Emirates, who's playing a tremendous tournament. He has 5.5. And Yu Yangyi, Chinese star, who has 5.5. And in the next round, round 8, we have Giri with the white pieces against Yu, and Salem with the white pieces against Kramnik. 2 rounds to play, and the tournament is still wide open.